Daniel Black, they call me Dan. I finished my Navy career as an E5. I was a sonarman. Enlisted from Washington State, boot camp at the Naval Training Center in San Diego. I enjoyed it. In other words, I didn't find it too restrictive. I found the fact that if you have to have your bunks a certain way and have your sea bag folded a certain way and your clothes folded a certain way, that's fine. I didn't mind the discipline. I came from a family of discipline, and it just wasn't something where I found myself getting all excited about it. You have to clean the head, you have to polish the bright-work, you have to scrub the toilets. Fine, they need to be done anyway. You might as well do it and do them right. So I didn't have a problem with boot camp. Scrubbing your clothes, if you're familiar, you have to scrub your clothes every night. And not only did you scrub your clothes, but the next morning, when you put the dry ones on that you had, they better be clean. Because you had an inspection every morning where they ask you to take your skivvy shirt and stick your thumb in here and turn it out like that, it better be clean. When they say you're all lined up at muster, uncover, you take your white hat off, and there better not be any kind of yellow around that white hat. And so you knew that, so you scrubbed them up and you did it right. I had no problem with boot camp at all whatsoever. Well, the chow hall at boot camp, you know, it's the food. It depends when you get there. You're eating off of metal trays. There's no such thing back in those days as plates. It was metal trays. And if your company, I was in company 292, which is usually about 75 sailors in there. If your company got there early, the metal trays were still cold. If you got there later, they'd come out of the scullery and they were hot and they were steaming and they were wet. The food was, you come through the line and you don't get to pick anything out. They put it on there. You get used to it. Again, I wasn't the type that got excited about that. That didn't bother me. Boot camp didn't bother me at all. In fact, I got into color guard because I was the right height and I could march. And I would, when they'd say left face, I'd turn left. You know, I knew how to do. So I got into color guard, and then I was promoted to the brigade commander. So I got the opportunity to lead the entire brigade during our graduation, which is just me and a bugler and a guidon bearer. And we march on this great big grinder with a haul. I'm thinking 4 times 10, probably about 40 companies all at the same time, and they all march and review. And they brought some dignitaries in at the dignitary stand and all that. So I was the brigade commander for that. Well, no fixed ammunition weapons whatsoever. It was the old M1 Garand, and what you did is you used it for exercise because you had to learn something called, I believe it was called the 16-count manual, where you did all kinds of things with it and do it right. But it was not, there was no live fire training weapons at boot camp when I went through. I don't recall, we didn't use a 45. The kids from California, we were pretty much, you could pretty much relate to them. But we had, in our company, we must have had a dozen or so from the southeast, Alabama and Mississippi, black kids. And it was just so awfully unfortunate talking to them, and then they were surprised too, because back where they were with the Jim Crow laws, they couldn't ride in the front of the bus, you know, and they couldn't sit at lunch counters and things. So when we finally got, you don't get liberty in boot camp until about the 4th or 5th week. A couple of them that you would talk to were obviously pleased that they could do the things in San Diego, which was a very open Navy town, that they couldn't do back home. But we related with them very well. I mean, we didn't have any problems. We had no real animosities I can recall in boot camp. We had a company commander who was as mean and nasty, and he could curse like a sailor, like a drunken sailor. But you just roll with the punches, you know. I think one of the first times we went to see, when they took us all in to have a meeting with the chaplain, they take the Catholic students, or the Catholic recruits, and they all go in, and the chaplain would talk to them, and in the Protestant they talk to them. He just said, you know, you're going to hear language that you don't want to use at home, but that's the way it is, and you know, get excited about it. And there's a few kids that you get their back up because they get upset, you know. And then a few that didn't do well in their studies, because probably didn't do well in high school either. But it was a good experience. I mean, I could never say there was anything about my Navy experience that I disliked or that I don't think is beneficial to anybody later on in life. You know, wait till you go to work sometime and find out that you don't like your boss. Well, if you've gone through some of these experiences, you know that you're not going to like every boss that you ever come up against. It's just not going to happen. You kind of roll with the punches. And then you put in your mindset is, someday I'm going to be a supervisor or a manager, and I'm going to learn from this guy. That's not the way I'm going to do it. Then I had 6 months at the Fleet Sonar School, which is also in San Diego. It's right across from the Naval Training Center. At the time, when I was in my last year of high school, my dad we had a parking garage, and I worked for him in the parking garage. And the Navy recruiter was a chief petty officer, and I started talking to him. He started telling me a little bit about the Navy, and I sort of liked the idea of the Navy. Maybe it was from watching movies, and John Wayne, and all that kind of stuff. And I played ball too. I was an athlete. I played ball and all that sort of thing. So he said, if you go in, I can get you in there if you've got good grades into something called EFSR, Electronics Field Seaman Recruit. You just sign up for that. That means that you're guaranteed an electronics field school. Radar, sonar, radio, any one of those three. You're not going to be just a shipboard sailor. You're not going to be scrubbing decks and that sort of thing. And that's guaranteed, so you sign up for that. But you got to make sure that you do well in boot camp and don't screw up your grades or something. So then I had the opportunity to be in the electronics field to pick, I believe it was either sonar or radar. And sonar sounded interesting. Submarines, chasing submarines or getting on a submarine. And that was an intensive school. The first 3 months were electronics, both electric and the electronic side. And we learned everything about motors and capacitors and batteries and resistors and all those things. And then the last 3 months was how to operate the sonar gear, which at that time was, if you remember when computers first came out, you could fill a whole room with a computer. Well, back then the sonar gear, you could fill a whole lot. You could fill these big cupboards here with the sonar gear. It was warm, and it was essentially lots of electronics in there. It's sophisticated now. So we did that for the last three months of sonar school, plus 4 or 5 trips out in those destroyers for 1 or 2 nights at a time. And that's where you got a chance then to use the gear and chase at least echo range for submarines. Came out of San Diego, and there'd be a submarine out there, and the destroyer escort. These were all World War II ships with the old sonar gear. And they get out there and they meet with the submarine, and the sub would go off, and then they'd go off and chase it, and we would practice with it. But the guys got seasick. Okay, they put what a 5-gallon bucket looks like. That 5-gallon bucket's down in the sonar shack, and the sonar shack isn't a hell of a lot bigger than a phone booth, but it's quite small. There's only room for maybe 2 or 3 people in there. If you got sick, into the bucket, but you weren't going outside. You just got sick, and the bucket would sit there until it was 3/4 full, and somebody's got to take it out and throw it overboard. So I mean, it wasn't one of these things, oh, we feel sorry for you because you're sick to your stomach. You know, you're just going to vomit, and that's it. Some people found this repulsive, but again, if you roll with the punches, you find out later on in life that there's going to be things that are probably a whole lot much more distressing than these little things. But sonar school was great. I mean, we enjoyed it. It was classes all day long, every day, and good camaraderie. The barracks, we lived in a barracks, and these are old World War II type barracks. The bunk beds, obviously bunk beds. Even while standing watch, when I was at the Fleet Sonar School, we stood watch with a carbine. We'd stand 2-hour watches at the sonar school out on a dock. It was a long dock, and that's where there was usually like 2 destroyer escorts there, because that's what the sonar school people were training on, as destroyer escorts. These were, by the way, these were little round bottom destroyer escorts too, so when they went to sea, you better have a strong stomach. That's all I gotta say, because when we got out there, people were sick, and they were sick over and over and over again, and that was probably one of the most uncomfortable experiences you're ever going to have is seasickness. And anyway, we were carrying these carbines on the long dock when you were out there all night from midnight to 2 or 2 to 4 or whatever it was, 4 to 6. And it's foggy and chilly in San Diego overnight, and particularly that time of year. But we had no ammunition on these weapons. At that time, there just wasn't any. At that time, at the completion of the sonar school, you got the billets were assigned, as to most of them, destroyers. Once in a while, a submarine. Number 1 in the class, I happened to be class honorman, and there was 1 billet to the helicopter squadron. So then I became a sonarman in a helicopter anti-submarine squadron, which was based at Reed Field, which is south of San Diego. Helicopter anti-submarine squadron 4. As an air crewman, we went through the same training in survival school as the pilots, and we went to survival school. It was in San Diego, and they taught you obviously how to get out of at that time, how to get out of a harness in a cockpit with a Mae West on. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the Dilbert Dunker before. Well, at the survival school, they have something called the Dilbert Dunker. And what this is a big platform. It was like just the cockpit of a Hellcat or a Corsair, I forget, it was a World War II plane. And it's up on top of this platform, and I'm guessing that platform is 25, 30 feet high. You get up in there and they strap you in. This is over the top of a pool. The pool's probably, I'm going to say the deep end is probably 20 feet because it's a pool they use for this purpose. So you get in there and you got your Mae West on, your flight suit, strapped in with a full harness and everything. And then they cut it loose, and this cockpit goes down and tips over upside down like this into the pool. And there's frogmen down there in case you can't get up. But the idea is now you're upside down, undo your harness, turn like this, and try to get your feet so that your feet now are at the cockpit because it's upside down. Push yourself down to come out from underneath, and then come up, inflate your Mae West, and that's what you're going to do if you ever crash. Well, of course, most of these guys that were pilots, obviously, they were going to be in an aircraft that had a cockpit, but helicopters, we weren't going to have that. Your only hope was that somehow you could get out. But you know, you just didn't think about it. It was sort of the thing that maybe at that age you don't think about it. It just happens. But survival school was a very interesting experience because then you spent 2 nights on the beach there in San Diego because you had to be in and out of the water, and they did some practice picking them up out there too. You got practice being picked up by somebody. And then they sent you up to the mountains. This is the mountains up in San Diego mountains. And you spent 3 days up there, no food. They didn't give you any food at all. And all you had on was your flight suit. And the whole idea was that there was a group of airmen and air crew, both of us enlisted and the officers, and they were supposed to they briefed us, get from point A to point B without getting captured. And of course, who's going to capture us? They're Marines. So the Marines are out there, and you're supposed to try to get from here to there. And you had maps and things, and I don't remember all the details other than this was on the 2nd to 3rd day. I got captured. And they put me in the back of a truck with 4 or 5 others. And they took us to the camp. This was supposed to be, you're a prisoner of war now. And you've seen those little huts that they've seen for real. And they put you in the hut for a while. It was hot. And then they get you out, and they had something called making you squat on a stick. And the stick is it's almost like an axe handle. It's very stiff. And they put it behind your knees and make you squat. And it was so painful, you know, and then you'd fall over, and then because you had your hands tied behind your back. They treated us like prisoners. They treated us like dirt because Marines probably got a kick out of doing it to the Navy. It was all fun and games, but it wasn't any fun. But that was part of survival school. And it was, all you could say about survival school was, oh, I'm glad we made it through. It was interesting because about 15 or 16 of us were all sonarmen who were trained how to use sonar gear in a destroyer or a destroyer escort, because that's what we trained in when we were at sonar school. And now we had to learn how to use sonar gear out of a helicopter. Totally new concept. No scope to look at. It was old searchlight gear like they'd used probably early on in the war. The helicopters were assigned to aircraft carriers for their training. Well, the way the helicopter would operate would be out over the water, and they would hover down around 50 to 100 feet. And we had a transducer on a long cable. And the pilot would say down dome when he come to hover and stop there, and you drop the transducer in the water, and then the sonarman sitting there would be able to turn a wheel and the transducer would go around. And it would echo range looking for submarines. The beauty of the helicopter is that the helicopter would be over the water and there'd be no wake from other ships. And that way the transducer would be circling around in 360 degrees, or however you wanted to do it, and you weren't bouncing the sound waves off of the wake like you would with a destroyer. But it's an interesting concept. The helicopter Anti-Submarine Squadron 4, HS-4, deployed on the USS Boxer in June of 1956. And it was the first time that that aircraft carrier had become an anti-submarine warfare aircraft carrier. So we had one squadron, our squadron helicopters, and a squadron of the Grumman S2F, which is a fixed wing. So the whole idea was this is a hunter-killer type group. The Boxer had been very historically involved in the Korean War, a lot of battles in the Korean War. But this was the first time they deployed as a hunter-killer operation. So the Far East cruise, we went to Hawaii. We were there for a couple of weeks. For all of us 18, 19-year-olds particularly, it was very interesting to see Fort Island, to see the remnants of the Arizona, which at that time the Arizona Memorial was not even functioned. All there was a flag and a float, that's all there was. But to see the whole idea, and then from the air, in a helicopter, flying around Pearl Harbor was fascinating to see what it looked like. So then from Pearl Harbor on over to Japan. The aircraft carrier usually pulled into Yokosuka. The squadrons, our squadron, would offload to a little base called Opama. It was a former Japanese seaplane base. It was in Tokyo Harbor. The fixed wing S2S would fly off to a base called Atsugi. So the ship might be there in port for 10, 12 days while the squadrons offload, and then we do our operations out of wherever we happen to be. It was quite interesting, obviously, to see Japan, even though it was, this is 1956, so it's 10 years after the war. They treated the servicemen fairly. It was still interesting to see that country, recognizing what the war was all about as much as we could. The cruise continued on down. We saw Kobe, Osaka. We're able to go ashore and see some of those, the temples and things like that. It was the first time we took a tour on a bus. We got on the Japanese bus, and the seats were so narrow that two of us couldn't sit side by side. They just didn't make the seats to fit Navy sailors. So from there on down to Sasebo, which was also a very popular port to go into. So we saw the parts of Japan, and then interestingly enough, went to Hong Kong. And we went to Hong Kong, and we pulled into Hong Kong in November of 56. And at that time, the Hungarian Revolution was going on, and the Russians were attacking Hungary. And as the ship pulled in, and the tug is trying to get you into the pier, and they weren't going to anchor, they were just going to stay off. So we didn't go to the pier, we anchored out in the bay, and all these little Chinese junks came up close. So they had the ship's company on the Boxer man the fire hoses all around the ship, not let them get close. And of course, we're wondering, what's this all about? Well, there's a possibility that they could attach bombs to the hull and that sort of thing, so we don't want to let it get close. At the same time, sailors on the flight deck or hangar deck are throwing coins off the side, and these young Chinese people are diving off the junks into the water after the coins, but at the same time, the fire hoses are trying to keep them from getting too close. So anyway, we're in Hong Kong, and it's port and starboard liberty. One side off, one side has to go ashore. So first thing you do, our day to go to shore, everyone goes to shore, and almost the first thing you do is go to a clothing shop. Got to go get some clothes because the Hong Kong tailor is famous. You get into the Hong Kong tailor shop, and the first thing they do is give you a cold bottle of San Miguel beer, and you can't even finish it before they give you another one. And by the time you get out of there, you've bought some type of wool suit coat or pants that you probably would never wear, which almost all of us bought those. And they said, "No, they'll be ready in about 5 days." Well, 2 days later, we were waiting, it was port and starboard liberty, so we're back the next day. And then the first thing you know, I think it was on the 5th of November, the Suez Canal was bombed. So all of a sudden, the ship, all liberty's been canceled. We're bringing everybody back from Hong Kong, bringing them back from shore. Those people who have clothing to pick up that think it might be ready, we're going to let you go get them because we're taking off. And we did. We pulled out of Hong Kong way before they were scheduled to pull out of Hong Kong. Again, as we're young sailors, we're not sure what this is all about other than what they tell us. But so we left Hong Kong because of both the Hungarian problem with the Russians going back into Hungary, and then the Suez Canal was bombed. So the concept as we understand it was, don't leave aircraft carriers in port anywhere, and certainly not when you're this far away from where you should be. So then we went out and just circled around the South China Sea for probably almost 3 weeks. By that time, there wasn't even any powder to make powdered milk with. I mean, the food was at that time just scraps almost, because we weren't getting any supplies and there was no supply ships right in the area. But nonetheless, we headed back up then and spent, I guess this was in November, so we got back up into Yokosuka probably by around Christmas time, and most of us spent either Christmas on the ship or offloaded at the base where they would send the squadron. So it was an interesting cruise. Everybody was told this will be the last cruise of the Boxer. Turns out it wasn't, but we were told it was going to be the last cruise because they were talking about not doing anything with it. As I understand, subsequently it became an assault type vessel for a couple of more years. So we headed back to the States, got back to the United States probably in February of '57. Interesting cruise, very enjoyable. I think we all learned a lot of things, what it's like to be out at sea and on an aircraft carrier. The Boxer was an Essex class, was not modified. It did not have the closed-in bow. It didn't have the canted flight deck. It still had the wooden flight deck. In fact, fortunately, we lost no aircraft. The fixed wings didn't lose any planes. They had a couple that kind of crash landed on the deck, and it was interesting that propellers would dig into the wood because those were wooden flight decks, whereas the newer aircraft carriers had a molded flight deck of some sort. So I spent the rest of my time then in active duty at the Naval Air Station in Greenfield. Back, let's see, then in I stayed in the reserve, and then in 62 and 60, well, I guess it was 62, moved to the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, where I joined Helicopter Squadron 871 in the Naval Reserve. Same kind of planes, and obviously my experience was great because they didn't have any others that had been active duty operating as an anti-submarine warfare type of technician. We spent our 1 weekend a month, and I guess flying around as air crew all around San Francisco Bay, all around Alcatraz, under the Golden Gate Bridge, over the Golden Gate Bridge, everywhere around the area was great. It was great. And then obviously out to sea to the extent that they could practice. You have to have a submarine to practice on. But you can also practice on a ship, because if you're echo ranging, you can pick up a ship and you can be able to echo range and give the appropriate direction and range to the pilot if that's what they're trying to do. But we had opportunities. They flew up around the wine country. We flew up, one time flew all the way up to Lake Tahoe. And it's interesting, helicopters generally fly 1,500, 2,000 feet, maybe 2,500 feet. Lake Tahoe is at 7,000 feet. And if you're flying at 7,000 feet, obviously you're going to have to be about 8,000 or 9,000 feet. You better be dressed warm, because there's no heat there. And it gets cold. It really gets cold. You had a flight jacket on, and hopefully you had on long underwear. You knew you were going to go up that high. So. But that was an interesting aspect. I think as a reserve, when you spent your 2 weeks every summer on a cruise, we spent one at we went all the way to Florida, to the Naval Air Station at down at the very tip of Florida, Key West, Naval Air Station Key West. We spent one at Naval Air Station Barbers Point in Hawaii, which was an interesting trip because they flew the whole squadron over to the C-130, and obviously there's no seats in the C-130, just the benches. It seems like it took them forever, but it probably took them close to 8 or 9 hours in a C-130. And Naval Air Station Barbers Point is over on the, seems to me it's over on the west side of Oahu. And we had our 2 weeks there. Probably the most, I guess, frightening time I ever had was when we were out doing pickups. Doing pickups practice in survival techniques where the helicopter, I should say the helicopters always on the aircraft carrier would always fly Angel. They'd fly 2 helicopters off this starboard side of the carrier. Whenever the fixed wing planes are taking off and landing, you always got 2 helicopters out there in case the plane goes down ditches, you have to go get them. But helicopters, as a rule, we have a winch on the side where you can pick up survivors in the water, and you have to practice doing that. And we were practice doing that off the coast of Oahu. And I think I had just picked up the 3rd guy. There was 3 of us in the plane. This is where the crewman tells the pilot to right over here, easy on or easy off, easy port, easy starboard, etc. You drop the sling down, the guy gets in the sling, and then you back up. Well, I was just bringing him up, and the plane just started to settle down, all the way down. I just got him into the hatch, and the wheels of the plane, of the helicopter, actually touched into the water. And he had full power, as much as he could get to get that thing up and go over and set it down on the sand. He oversped the engine so bad that in another 5 seconds we would have gone into the water, and we were probably, I'm going to say, maybe 200 yards offshore. The survival rate of a helicopter like that is not real good. So fortunately, everybody made it over there all right. So, and we had to spend the rest of the day over there waiting for the crew to come out to see if they could change. I think they changed something in the engine in order to get it to go off again. But anyway, that was the only time I really had a frightening experience that I could ever point to. It's hard to say because you're not strapped into your seat, you know, so maybe all we've been told is that if a helicopter goes in the water with those big blades going like that, it's going to tip over right away, and it's going to really thrash around, and your ability to get out is not real good. One of the things I found while I was in there is that the officers were making a lot more money. They had certainly better quarters and things like that, so I figured I'm going to go to college because that's the only thing that they had that I didn't. Mostly all the college graduates, and I went in the Navy right out of high school. So I started going to school, and I went. Took me several years, but I finally did. So then I had a second career and went to work for the Internal Revenue Service, and at that time was the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax Division of the Internal Revenue Service, and subsequently became the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Bureau in the Treasury Department, separated out from the Internal Revenue Service. That's the agency that was responsible for enforcing all of the prohibition laws back in the days of prohibition. At the same time, as a young inspector, we were responsible for protecting the revenue of somewhere in the neighborhood of between 14 and 20 billion dollars of revenue. And this was at distilleries where you had thousands of barrels of whiskey that were stored with the tax on a barrel at over $1,000 a barrel. So there's a lot of tax involved. So we were responsible for that, as well as the cigarette taxes. And then in 1968, the Gun Control Act of '68 went into effect, which changed the gun control in this country to a great extent. And ATF became the primary agency then to try to enforce the gun laws. Not popular with most people, but nonetheless, it's, you know, as a member of a federal agency, you're required to enforce the laws as Congress passes them. That's one of the toughest things that people can't understand. Why are these agencies doing what they're doing? Well, they're doing it because Congress passed a law and says do it. And oftentimes, that was a Congress that's not in effect at that time, you know, so it's another Congress that's saying, we don't like what you're doing. Well, if you don't like it, then you're going to change the law. But, so I had a 30-year career with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. I retired in 1996 as deputy director. And of course, we had some very historical and tragic episodes during my career, including Waco, which was tragic in many, many ways because we lost 4 good agents and we had 20 people that were injured in a raid at a compound down in Waco, Texas, in which the agents were surprised because they didn't expect a firefight. The individual that had that compound down there, the Branch Davidians, they were stockpiling guns and ammunition and grenades and all of the things that were illegal at the time, and our agents knew it was that way. The fact that they had lots of women and children in there was probably incidental to the fact that we went in there trying to serve a search warrant to confiscate those guns. And these were automatics and semi-automatics. These were guns that were illegal at the time. But anyway, it turned out to be, as most people understand, it was a tragic situation, the way Waco ended. But I'd have to say that both careers were very exciting, very challenging. And I think that you can have a military career and you can also have a civilian career, as lots of us do.